Hello YouTube, you might have seen a video that I posted up recently about these rather spectacular insects. These are called Siliquifera grandis, or the giant hooded katydid, and they get absolutely massive. So I bought 5 tiny little nymphs back in September. When I say tiny, I mean they were about the size of my little fingernail, and now they're fully adult, and basically that has taken 3 months. It's now December, so that's pretty spectacular to get from that tiny to as massive as they are now in just 3 months. So when they're tiny little nymphs like the size of my little fingernail, when they shed their skin at that stage, they basically double in size, and then when they do their next molt, they double in size again, and every time they do a subsequent molt, they double in size. When they get to adulthood, when they do their final molt, they more than double in size, because basically their wings unfold. They get these massive wings, and you can see them on this particular specimen. They just look like a really huge leaf. Even with all the kind of wing veins and things, just look like the veins in leaves. This particular species of hooded katydid is from Papua New Guinea. You can also find it in Indonesia. I think there is another species of hooded katydid, but it's from Australia. Looks similar, but nowhere near as big. This one from Papua New Guinea, I think, is probably one of the largest katydids in the world. I think it's got an overall wingspan of about 25 centimeters, so absolutely massive. In my previous video, I had just had a male do his final molt, and he was massive enough, but this female is even bigger. I had read that she was going to be, but I don't think I was quite prepared for just how much bigger. Like, she's much bulkier, and I guess a lot of that is to do with the fact that she's full of eggs, and they need to be fertilized, but she needs all that extra space for the eggs inside her. She's also, she appears bigger because she's got the massive ovipositor on the back of her abdomen, and I'll show you that a bit later. It's basically just a long egg laying tube. It looks a little bit menacing because I think a lot of people, when they first see it, it's a big spiky looking thing. They think, is it a sting? Is it something that she's going to hurt me with? But it's not. It's literally just to allow her to kind of push it down into the soil to lay her eggs. If you're watching this video and you're thinking, what is a katydid? That is a name that I've never heard of before. That doesn't surprise me, because quite a few people haven't heard of them. Basically, they're in the order Orthoptera, so they're right in there with grasshoppers, locusts and crickets, and those are all ones we're familiar with. But katydids, unless you've come from a tropical country, you're unlikely to have heard of them really. It's not the sort of thing that comes up very often. They certainly don't live in the UK. I saw quite a load of different species of katydids when I spent a year in Australia, and a lot of those I considered at the time to be massive, but they were, less than half the size of this one. If somebody were to ask me what do I think a katydid looks most like, a locust, a grasshopper or a cricket, I would probably say a cricket, but a particular type of cricket called a bush cricket. Here in the UK we have a species called the great green bush cricket, which is a very spectacular insect in its own right, and I found them before. They live like in reeds, basically on the edge of rivers and that kind of thing, and when you first come across them you can just hear them chirping, and then you get closer and closer to where the chirping's coming from, and then if you're lucky you spot them. Because they're bright green, they blend in really well with the reeds. But yeah, they're a very similar look to this katydid that you're looking at here, especially when you look at them closely and you see them chomping on something like this one is here. So if you haven't twigged what's going on in this particular video, this is a female and she's literally just done her final molt, and the white that you're seeing here is her skin, and when they shed their skin they spend quite a lot of time eating it afterwards, and this is for a very good reason, because the skin contains lots of nutrients and it just gives them a good meal each time they shed. You can see why these insects need quite a lot of space when it comes to doing their final molt. It's because they basically cling on to some leaves or branch with their legs, and then they shed out of their skin, and they're really soft and vulnerable at that point. Then they spend a lot of time drying themselves out and also pumping up their wings to their full size. If they're trying to pump up their wings to the full size and they suddenly hit the bottom of the cage, you can see what's going to happen is they're not going to form properly. Basically, the wings won't pump up fully, they'll just dry and they'll all be sort of crumpled up, and that is not ideal at all. I would recommend giving them at least a foot of space below where they're going to hang. That will give them enough space to pump up their wings. So you can keep these insects in groups, but I'm not sure that I recommend that. What I've been doing is keeping them individually, and then I'm waiting basically until they do their final molt. And then I've heard that if you leave them for a couple of weeks before you introduce them for mating, that's what I'm going to do. So I've got my female, she'll be in one tub. I've got a male in another tub, and then I've got other males as well. And I have heard something where it said that you're more likely to get them to mate if you have the female in one cage and then you introduce the males in with her, and more than one male basically, because I think they sort of fight over her and that kind of gets them going a little bit. Right, at this point in the video I thought I would put my hand sort of close to her to give you a rough idea of the size that she is. I don't think this even really does it justice, and what I'd like to do really is have her on my hand and show you that, but even that I'm a bit wary of because I've seen how she eats and the jaws are really quite strong. You can just see here a bit of shed antennae, very thin. I was a bit worried when I first saw it. I thought one of her new antennae had fallen off, but it was just a bit of shed antennae. You can see, if you look carefully, you can see them both still on here. Yeah, I was saying how much I think it would hurt if she bites you. I think just because they've got really powerful jaws. And when I was young, there was an insect that I found in France called a wart biter, which was a type of bush cricket, and it had very similar looking jaws to this. And yeah, I've heard that that gives you a nasty bite, but its head was probably a third of the size of this thing's. So I'd be a bit wary. I think you can hold them, and I think they're normally pretty good, but I think I'd be ready with something like a spoon, because then if she came down with her mouth close to my skin, I would just tuck the spoon underneath just to make sure that she was chomping on the spoon rather than on my finger. The other thing with really large insects like this is their feet. Their feet have got little tiny hooks on them, which just means, it doesn't hurt or anything, but it just means that if they're on you, if I've got one of these on my hand, they really cling to your hand. So if it did suddenly decide it wanted to chomp down on you, trying to detach the whole insect becomes a bit of a nightmare. So yeah, being ready with something like a spoon you could put in the way to stop her from biting you would be a really good idea, I think. If you watched my previous video, I explained that my plan was going to be to put them in this cage that I've got that is about 1 metre tall, and it's got a lot of kind of bogwood and stuff like that in it. I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. I think it's going to be easier just to buy an extra massive tub. Like, I don't think they need quite as much space as I was thinking they would, certainly not 1 metre tall. I will probably be housing, yeah, like the one female with maybe 2 or 3 males, I would say, at a time. So I'll probably put them in a big tub, because then I can keep the humidity high. I'll just have a big pot in there with lots of bramble in it, and then I'll just have soil at the bottom of the cage, or, well, not soil, but eco earth probably, which is like coconut fibre. That is just something for her to lay her eggs in. I've read that it needs to be at least 4 centimetres, and they recommend more like 5 to 7 centimetres of this eco earth. The eggs apparently are quite long, and they look a little bit like grains of rice. And another thing that I've read, which is quite interesting to me, is that basically when they're laid, upright, and you've got to try and keep them in that same upright position. Like, it's no good digging them up and, laying them on their side or turning them upside down. It's a bit like when you've got reptile eggs, you've got to do a similar sort of thing. With a reptile egg, you've got to make a little dot on it, really. That is a good idea. It's a good kind of practice to get into, like putting a little dot on to show the upright position of the egg, and then keeping them in that same position throughout incubation. It's going to be the same with these guys. I'm going to have to be really careful when I take the eggs out to keep them all upright in the same position. I just think it would be really awful to get your temperatures completely accurate, get your humidity levels right, and all the conditions correct, but then you've laid down your eggs and they all die anyway because they're not in the right position. In a lot of the larger species of stick insect, when you keep them in a very similar way to how I'm keeping these. And some of them, they just lay their eggs and they just basically pop them out from their abdomens, and they just let them land on the substrate below. They kind of ping them. So it doesn't really matter what orientation the eggs are in. And even the ones where they do bury their eggs, when you dig them up, you don't have to keep them in any kind of upright position. You can just incubate them however you want. But with these, yeah, it's important to orientate them properly. I just think it's great that they've got this long ovipositor and they lay it in the substrate, because a lot of different katydid species will only lay their eggs in like a stem. So you've got to have a stem of a plant, and a lot of the stems have to be kind of hollow inside, and then they'll lay their eggs in a row, like a sort of, if you imagine a row of grains of rice going all the way along a stem, and that must be a nightmare to try and incubate those. So with these, yeah, I'm just really grateful that they actually lay their eggs in the substrate. So from what I've read, the female sheds her skin, does her final molt, as mine is here. Then what you're supposed to do is wait for 2 weeks. So that's going to be a hard wait, because you're really keen to kind of pair up get the male in there with her as quickly as possible. But apparently that's not a good idea. You should wait a couple of weeks so she's fully kind of hardened her exoskeleton and she's completely ready for him. And at that point, when I introduce my male, like I say, I'm going to introduce more than one male. Probably 2 males, if not 3 males, I'm going to put in with her. And then that should get them even more excited, because they'll be kind of trying to fend each other off. And then when they mate, apparently the male will attach his abdomen to her abdomen and then leave like a spermatophore on the end of her abdomen. This just looks like a white globular mass, I think. And at this point, probably what I would do is then remove the other males and that male too. Take them all out so that you're just left with the female with the spermatophore attached. This will just prevent any of the other males from maybe chewing on the spermatophore, because it's a sort of a part liquid kind of mass, and anything like that might attract another male to come and try and eat it off. So yeah, try and avoid that. Incidentally, remember I was talking about keeping these individually in separate tubs when you're rearing them up? There's a very good reason for that, and that is when they shed their skin, if you keep them in groups, they're really soft and vulnerable when they've just shed. And another one could come along and it could start nibbling one that's really soft and vulnerable, and it could actually kill it. Even at the show that I went to where I bought my nymphs, there were some adults on display, and I noticed that one of the adults, the hood section, had been nibbled by another one. So that just shows that if you do keep them in together, you have a very real risk that one of them might mistake the other one for food and start eating a big chunk out of it. It might have just confused it with a leaf. If you're rearing these up in the UK, then I've heard that their favourite food plant of all is beech. I was actually feeding them on hazel though, because I had hazel in my garden. But then you've got to be careful in the winter, because you'll probably have the same problem that I had, where I was feeding them on hazel, and then in the wild, in the garden, all of the hazels started to change colour. They went into their autumn colour, and then all the leaves fell off the trees, and then you're left with just twigs and branches. So at that point, I had to switch them over to bramble, which is fine. The bramble keeps going all the way through the winter if you're lucky, so that's okay. And I was doing all right with the bramble. But it's just worth knowing that they can eat other things as well. Like, I've also heard that they can eat oak and apple. So it's worth finding out what plant species you've got near you. But just bear in mind, if it is winter time and the leaves start falling off the trees, worst case scenario, you've still got bramble. What I preferred about feeding them on the hazel was just that the leaves are about 3 times thicker than bramble leaves, so it feels a lot more substantial. And the other obvious thing that I preferred is that they're not spiky. With the brambles, you're getting prickled the whole time when you're changing their food. Another observation that I made is that, when you're keeping caterpillars and things like that, or a lot of different stick insect species, they tend to be nibbling the leaves from the edges, and that's what I was kind of used to. With these guys, their jaws are so powerful that even with the thick hazel leaves, they can start eating the leaf right in the middle, and they can make a big hole in the centre of a leaf and kind of work outwards from the hole. The other thing I noticed is that they will also tuck into the actual twigs. So the twigs of hazel, which are quite woody and quite, solid, they will actually manage to chomp through that as well. Which is another reason why I'm thinking that their jaws are particularly strong. I thought that I would do this whole video in sort of real time pretty much, so that you could see how long it takes for them to eat their entire skin. So she's getting there now, like she's eaten all of the kind of the bulk part of her skin, and she's just chomping through the last sort of couple of legs. And you can see, like, the legs, they really feel quite tough. The skin feels really tough, and she's really noshing through this. You can see the serrations on her jaws if you look closely at the video. Also, if you look closely on this video, you'll see on her front legs there are little oval dips, and those are actually her ears, believe it or not. When I took my male adult in to show my students, some of the main questions they asked were, does it jump or does it fly? And the answer to that is yes, both. But not very much. The jumps, they're pretty kind of sluggish, these, because they're such heavy insects. So if they do jump, they don't jump very much. It's like sort of less than a foot kind of thing. And they tend to jump just to kind of get away from you, and then they sort of settle down quite quickly. They more walk basically all over the place, but if they're going to fly as well, they would fly, and it would be a short flight, like maybe across a sort of narrow width room. That's about it really. They don't sort of fly around like a dragonfly or anything like that. Again, because they're so heavy and bulky, they're only kind of built for kind of short flights and kind of long hops, that sort of thing. People also asked if I would recommend these for beginners, and I definitely would. I think they're really quite a hardy species, and especially if you've kept other stick insect species like jungle nymphs or the giant prickly stick insects, that kind of thing, or the giant thorny stick insects. The care of these is very similar to those. You've just got to keep them warm, like warmer than room temperature. So basically, if you've got a tub and you put a heat mat underneath it, that will be enough to give you the humidity. You can't give them a really ventilated tub, like with a sort of mesh covering, because it would be too dry for them. You need basically like a plastic tub with holes in it, and not very many holes, so it keeps the moisture in. And then you spray them with water. It's got to be not tap water, because that can be pretty poisonous for them because of all the chemicals that are in it. Just use spring water, bottled water, And yeah, spray them in the morning, and it's like a really good soaking with a spray bottle over all the leaves, and then you can spray them again in the evening. Right, what you're looking at on the screen now is the ovipositor. You can see it's a long kind of scythe-like implement attached to the kind of very tip of her abdomen, and that's what she uses to lay the eggs in the soil. Not that I've even got her to mate with a male yet, but I am hoping at some point I will do that, and then I will get to see her lay her eggs. It just depends, because they can be very secretive about it, and they can end up laying their eggs, I think, right in the middle of the night or something. So I might be asleep and I might miss it, but I really hope to catch it, and then I'll get it on video and put it on YouTube again at that point. Something else worth mentioning that's quite exciting about this species is with the stick insects. If you keep the stick insects, they can lay their eggs, and a lot of those eggs can take 6 to 9 months to hatch out. So you're waiting for ages for the eggs to hatch. With these guys, they take about 3 months, which is long enough still, but it should be pretty cool if they hatch out in only 3 months. You can see here, look, she's eating her sort of last leg, and yeah, just like literally managing to keep it in her mouth somehow. You can see how determined they are to actually eat the whole skin as well. They really want to get as much of that nutrition as possible each time they shed. I noticed that even in these hard bits of leg, like this little bit that's left that she's eating now, they're still moist inside. They've still got quite a bit of liquid in them, which is what I think kind of drives her on to keep chomping away at it. One thing that I haven't looked up yet is how many eggs they can lay, but if it's anything like other insects, like stick insects and things, it could be in the hundreds. That's what I'm hoping. But even if it is in the hundreds, if I get them all to hatch, you can imagine trying to rear up all of those. At first, when they're tiny, you could probably just keep them all in together and that would be fine. But when they start getting a little bit bulkier, I wouldn't want to risk it. I wouldn't want to risk them kind of nibbling on each other, and I'd want to have them all in individual containers. So if you have got hundreds, it's a good idea to start selling them off at that point and kind of spreading them around a bit. I'm definitely expecting that these are going to become as popular in the pet trade as the jungle nymph stick insects are. They've become really popular in recent times, and the thing with jungle nymph stick insects is they're a really nice species, and they're pretty docile most of the time, but occasionally you get a grumpy one, like a grumpy female or something, and if she wants, she can kind of grip you with her legs, and the legs have got loads of spikes on them, and that can be really quite painful. So you do have to be a little bit careful when handling those. And I suppose it's going to be the same with these guys. You know, most of the time they probably won't bite you, but if you did happen to get bitten, you probably wouldn't want to hold one again. You would just suddenly become a little bit more wary of them. If you're watching this video and you happen to be a teacher in a school and you're thinking about keeping some creatures in your classroom, these are the ideal kind of things to put in your classroom, because kids are going to absolutely love this. You know, just the sheer size of them means that every detail of the insect you can watch really closely, like the head and the eyes and the mouth parts, like just as it's eating like this, you can see all of that really clearly. You don't normally get to see that on like a just like your standard grasshopper or something in the garden. They're so small that to be able to see all these details, you'd have to look at it through a hand lens. What I think would be even more impressive in a classroom situation would be just to introduce the children or whatever to the insects when they're just in the nymph stage. So when they're absolutely tiny, like a centimetre or less in size, and then basically let the kids watch them as they grow, because they grow so quickly. Just over a term you can get them from, you know, being a tiny little nymph to this fully grown massive adult, and I don't think the kids will kind of believe what they turn into, and it would probably be good not to tell them what they're going to turn into and just let them, you know, watch them actually kind of grow in the classroom situation. They're not particularly expensive to buy as nymphs either, because I guess if they do have like hundreds of eggs, then you're ending up with all of these little nymphs that you've got to sell. So basically, I paid about £20 for 5 nymphs, which I think is an absolute bargain. All right, you can see she's just dropped her bit of leg, and probably in the wild, if she dropped this last bit of leg, she'd probably give up at this point. But because she's in captivity and I'm looking after her, I had the idea that I'd try and pick up the bit of leg and try and feed it to her again, give it back to her basically. Before I do that, I'll just mention that I've kept all kinds of exotic insects and invertebrates in the past, and I've got videos on this channel of pretty much all of the ones that I've kept, and they're kind of care videos, a lot of them, and a lot of them give you tips on how to breed them and that sort of thing. I also kept a lot of different reptiles and amphibians and small mammals, and now I've cut down on my collection substantially. I keep armadillos at the moment, and they're the things that I'm kind of specialising in. But I'm sure, as time goes on, I'll probably keep the odd thing like this every so often, just because I can't resist having something as a sort of a project to try and breed. If I can get things to breed, then it's a good sign for me that I've done well with them and I've kept them as happy as they can be in captivity. Things tend not to breed unless they're kind of in the most ideal conditions. So it's always, I always feel better if I can get things to actually breed. Okay, here's the bit of leg. You can see the leg was clinging on to the kitchen paper there. Wasn't a particularly easy thing to hold on to, this leg, because it's quite hard, but it's also quite spiky. You can just about see the white end to it there. That white end is quite liquidy, like I was saying before. See that I keep dropping it. But I think I managed to persuade her to start chomping on it again, and then she finishes it off, which is pretty cool. It's just nice knowing that she's going to eat the whole skin. Right, so the whole reason that I do these videos on YouTube is to give people tips on how to keep these animals and how to breed them successfully. That's the idea. So if any of you are watching this and you've got any extra ideas that you can give me, leave a comment, and it'll be interesting to hear anything that you've got to say. If you've got your own experiences that will help me as well, that's good. It's all a big learning curve for me and for everybody else that's watching as well. I'm thinking with the eggs, it's probably going to be similar to keeping stick insect eggs, apart from the fact that you've got to orientate them, keep them upright. So I think what I'm going to be doing is, keeping them in coconut fibre, because coconut fibre, you can kind of sterilise it in an oven first. But also, it's pretty sterile stuff anyway. Like, compared to soil, if you were to just put your eggs in soil, there's so many kind of microorganisms and bits and bobs in soil that can do your eggs harm, and also like your eggs are more likely to go mouldy and things. So it's going to be a case of just trying to keep it not too wet and not too dry. You don't want your eggs to dry out. You don't want your eggs to get too wet, because again they might go mouldy. So you've got to kind of wet your eco earth, and then you've got to kind of squeeze it all out so it's kind of just damp. A bit like if you got a bit of paper towel and you really squeezed it out. It's that sort of like level of dampness I think you need. And then I will be keeping them in a tub, and it'll just be a tub like a sort of a margarine tub or something like that, with a few holes in the top, like hardly any holes. Again, you don't want it to be all like a ventilated top or something, because that will just allow the soil to dry out too quickly. You want to keep the humidity in there. So it's going to be very similar to actually the humidity that you keep the adults in, really. Then you want a temperature that is warmer than room temperature, and what I've done in the past is I've put my eggs in like an airing cupboard, because the nice thing about an airing cupboard is it doesn't sort of get hot in the day and then cold at night. It tends to be the same sort of temperature constantly throughout the whole incubation process, and so that's why I like that. Failing that, you could set up like a heat mat, but you wouldn't want to put your eggs directly on a heat mat, but you could have it, you know, above a heat mat, and then keep that on the whole time, and that could act as a good incubator. You can even buy thermostats that attach to your heat mat to keep it at a very constant temperature, or you could heat up like the inside of a box, like a polystyrene box or something like that. That could be a really good way of making your own little incubator as well. Okay, I hope this video has been useful for some of you, and I hope that if you are considering keeping these, that this video might have persuaded you to go for it, because they really are fascinating species. Hit subscribe if you want to see any videos that I post up in the future, including more videos on these guys. Check out my other invertebrate videos if you get a chance, or my videos on amphibians and reptiles and small mammals. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.